3 days of rain, and it hadn't stopped once. 2 in the morning, a woman kneeling on a greenhouse floor, with her hands buried in the dirt, whispering to a dying seedling like it could hear her. Then something moved past the fence line. Not the wind. Not the rain. Something heavy, dragging itself through the mud. She stood. The lantern in her hand shook once. The light reached the broken fence and found a dark stain spreading through the water. Long. Still warm. Still coming. 11 years ago, a stretch of land was burned to the ground. Nobody around here ever spoke of it again. She didn't know that. She only knew something was dying 10 steps from where she stood. Rain hammered the glass. Past the tree line, a second sound. Closer this time. She dropped the trowel in the dirt. Then she ran toward it. The rain had been falling for 3 days, when Draven Ashwood finally understood he was going to die in a ditch behind a stranger's potting shed. Not in battle. Not on a throne. Not with his name carved into some monument that lesser alphas would spit on after he was gone. In a ditch. That was the joke of it. That was the punchline nobody would ever get to hear, because he'd be dead, and dead men don't tell punchlines. They just lie there. Bleeding. Getting rained on. Which felt, honestly, like an insult specifically designed for him. He dragged himself another 6 inches through the mud. His left flank screamed. Not figuratively. Actually screamed, a high animal sound that came out of his own throat before he could stop it, and he hated that sound, hated that his body had made it, without his permission, because the Alpha King of the Black Mire Dominion did not make sounds like that. Ever. Not in front of his war council. Not in front of his enemies. Not in front of the moon itself. But there was nobody here to hear it. Just rain. Just mud. Just the smell of his own blood going thin and sweet in the wet air, which meant it was still coming out fast, which meant he had maybe an hour before his body made the decision for him that his mind refused to make. Stop, Draven. Just stop. You've done enough. He didn't stop. Because stopping meant Rurik Vane's people had won. 3 of his border scouts were already dead in a ravine 6 miles north, and if Draven died too, quietly, anonymously, in some civilian's drainage ditch, then the ambush wasn't just a raid. It was a decapitation. It was the first domino in a war that would swallow 4 territories whole, and somewhere in the back of his skull, past the pain, past the animal panic clawing at the edges of his vision, the king in him kept doing math. 12 war packs. For territories. 1 dead king in a ditch. Do the math yourself. It doesn't end well for anybody. So he crawled. The tree line thinned. Something that might have been a fence appeared, wooden, half-collapsed, smelling of moss and old rain. Beyond it, warmth. A structure breathing heat into the cold night, windows fogged gold from the inside, glass panels stacked up toward a roof that didn't belong to any house he recognized. A greenhouse. Christ. A greenhouse. Of all the places to die. His vision tunneled. Narrowed to a single point of light, small and orange, coming from somewhere lower down. A window. No, a door left open a crack, and past it, a shape kneeling in the dirt at 2 in the morning, hands buried wrist deep in torn earth. A woman. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at something small and green and drooping in front of her, murmuring to it in a voice too soft to carry the words, and for one absurd, dying man's moment, Draven thought, she's talking to a plant. Who talks to a plant at 2 in the morning? In the rain. He must have made a sound. Some animal noise, some final desperate scrape of claws against wet ground, because her head came up. Fast. And her eyes found him in the dark, a massive black shape collapsed at the edge of her fence line, blood soaking into mud, one hind leg twitching in a way that no healthy leg should twitch, and Draven waited for the scream. Waited for her to run. She didn't. She dropped the trowel in her hand, and came toward him at a dead sprint, and the last thing he registered, before the world folded in on itself, was her voice, low, steady, absolutely certain, saying words that made no sense to a dying king, who had never once in his life been spoken to like this. "Okay," she said. "Okay. You're okay. I've got you." He was not okay. But something in him, some old, buried, 30-year-old part of him, that had never once been told, that by anybody, believed her anyway. Then the dark took him whole. Her name was Ren Sorrel, and if you'd asked her, that night, what she thought she was doing, dragging 400 pounds of bleeding wolf across a mud yard at 2 in the morning, with nothing but a tarp, and pure stubbornness, she would have told you the truth. She didn't know. She just knew she wasn't going to leave him there. Because that was the thing about Ren. That was the whole thing, if you boiled her down to one sentence, one fact that explained every strange decision she'd ever made. She could not walk past a living thing that was dying and just let it. Didn't matter if it was a half-drowned kitten under her porch. Didn't matter if it was a cutting so far gone that Hollis, her boss, had already thrown it in the compost pile 3 times. Didn't matter, apparently, if it was an enormous black wolf built like a tank, with teeth the length of her fingers, currently unconscious and bleeding all over her one good tarp. She hauled him inch by inch across the yard. Her shoulders screamed. Her knees were caked in mud past the joint. And somewhere around the halfway mark, soaked to the bone, arms shaking, she stopped and looked down at what she was doing, and had exactly one clear thought. This is insane. Then she kept pulling. Because the alternative, leaving him, walking away, calling it somebody else's problem, that wasn't a real option. That had never once in her whole life been a real option, and she didn't examine why too closely, because if she examined it too closely she'd have to think about her mother, and about a registry office that never called back, and about what it felt like to be the thing nobody thought was worth keeping. She wasn't doing that. Not at 2 in the morning. Not with a wolf dying on her tarp. She got him into the greenhouse. Floor heating, steady 20 degrees, the one warm dry place on her whole half-acre of rented land. She got a wool blanket over him that smelled like lavender and cedar because that was the blanket she kept for the barn cats, and she knelt beside him in the mud she'd tracked in and looked at the wound. Deep. Long torn, not clean, claws, not blades. Something had hit him hard, more than once, and left him for dead somewhere in the tree line behind her property. She was not a veterinarian. She said so. Out loud. To an unconscious wolf, because apparently that was a thing she did now. "You are going to hold very still," she told him, voice even though her hands were shaking, "because I am not a veterinarian. And I am going to be making this up as I go." He didn't answer. Obviously. He was a wolf, and he was unconscious, and none of this made sense, and she kept talking anyway, because the sound of her own voice was the only thing keeping her hands from shaking too hard to work. Warm water. Antiseptic she kept for the porch cats. A stack of dish towels printed with rosemary sprigs, because those were the only clean towels she had, and they were about to get ruined, and she found she didn't care. She cleaned the wound. She packed it. She sat with her hand flat against his ribs, counting each breath, because some terrified animal part of her brain had decided that if she looked away, if she stopped watching, he would simply stop. So she didn't look away. Not once. Not for hours. Outside, the rain kept coming, steady against the greenhouse glass, a sound she usually loved, and that night could barely stand, because every drop felt like a second she didn't have. She talked to fill the space, where a normal person would have called for help. She told him about the nursery. About the lavender that wasn't rooting right this season. About Hollis and his truck, and his refusal to speak more than 4 words at a time. None of it was for him. All of it was for her, a rope she was climbing hand over hand through the dark, and somewhere in the third hour her voice cracked on nothing in particular, and she pressed her forehead briefly to the top of his skull, and said, so quiet it barely counted as sound, "Please don't. Please don't be another thing I couldn't save." Not until gray light started leaking in, through the greenhouse glass, and his breathing, impossibly, evened out into something that sounded less like dying and more like sleep. She sat back on her heels. Blood on her hands. Mud past her elbows. Exhausted in a way that went past her body and into something older. And she looked at this enormous black animal breathing slow and steady on her greenhouse floor, and she said, quiet, mostly to herself, "There. See. Wasn't that hard?" It had been the hardest thing she'd done in 3 years. She just wasn't going to say that part out loud. He should have left the next morning. That was the plan. That was, in fact, the only plan. Wake up, assess the damage, shift back, walk out before the girl even knew what she'd been sleeping 6 feet away from. Get back to Bastion. Get back to the War Council. Get back to being a king instead of a wounded animal curled up in some stranger's plant nursery like a lost dog. He did not leave the next morning. He told himself it was tactical. The wound needed more time. Moving too soon risked reopening it, risked infection, risked exactly the kind of slow bleed out that had nearly killed him in that ditch. He told himself he needed eyes on the gray mist border, from ground level, an angle his scouts couldn't give him. He told himself several other things, each one a little more absurd than the last, and every single one of them fell apart the moment Ren Sorrel walked back into the greenhouse carrying a plate of scrambled eggs, and got down on the floor next to him like it was the most natural thing in the world. "Okay," she said. "You need to eat. I don't actually know what wolves eat, so." Eggs. Eggs seemed safe. He stared at the plate. He was the alpha king of a dominion that stretched across 4 territories. He had eaten in the halls of 6 different courts. He had been served food by hands trembling with fear, by hands trying to poison him, by hands that wanted something from him so badly they shook with it. Nobody had ever handed him scrambled eggs like this. Like it was just the food. Like he was just hungry. He ate the eggs. She watched him do it, with an expression he couldn't read yet, something between satisfaction and worry, and then she did something that made every ancient, dignified part of him want to crawl directly into the compost pile out of sheer humiliation. She checked his eyes with the flashlight on her phone. "I read that you're supposed to watch for signs of concussion," she explained, holding his enormous head steady with one hand while she clicked the light on and off in front of his eyes like he was a house pet who'd fallen off a porch. "Enlarged dogs. I don't know if it applies to whatever you are. But better safe." He was not a dog. He held very still and let her do it anyway. Because somewhere in the last 12 hours, some catastrophic internal alarm had gone off, and he could not, for the life of him, figure out how to make it stop. By the end of the first week, she'd named him Shadow. He hated it. He also answered to it, immediately, every time, without hesitation, which told him something deeply uncomfortable about himself that he chose not to examine too closely. She'd trimmed the matted fur around his wound with kitchen scissors, humming something tuneless, while she worked, and built him a bed out of old blankets in the corner of her bedroom, not the greenhouse, her bedroom, because, she explained with a seriousness that brooked no argument, the greenhouse gets cold at night, and you're still healing, and I will worry. I will worry. 3 words. Said so simply, so completely without performance, that they landed somewhere in his chest like a blade sliding between ribs he didn't know he had. Nobody worried about him. Not like that. His war council worried about the Dominion. His enemies worried about his sword arm. Bastion worried, in his gruff soldier's way, about logistics and succession, and whether Draven was about to get himself killed doing something reckless. Nobody worried about whether he was cold. He lay on the pile of blankets that night, in the corner of a stranger's bedroom, in a body that wasn't his own, and listened to her breathing even out, into sleep, and did not sleep himself for a very long time. Because, and this was the part that terrified him, the part he turned over and over in the dark like a stone he couldn't put down, because he did not want to leave. Not yet. Not tomorrow either, if he was honest. And Draven Ashwood was not, as a rule, a man who lied to himself. Except apparently he'd become exactly that kind of man, sometime between the ditch and the eggs and the flashlight in his eyes, and he had absolutely no idea how to undo it. There was a rhythm to those first days that he had never once experienced in 30 years of ruling. Mornings that began without a war table. Afternoons that passed without a single report of border skirmishes, tax disputes, treaty violations. He watched her work through the propagation greenhouse, from a patch of sun on the concrete floor, watched her hands move, with a competence that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with love, and some quiet part of him understood even then, before he had a name for it, that he was watching something he had never once been shown, as a king. Care given freely. Not extracted through obligation. Not offered because of his crown. Given, simply, because a thing was alive and hurting and within reach. He did not know what to do with that. So he did the only thing available to a man wearing a wolf's body. He stayed close. He learned the sound of her footsteps on gravel well enough to know, before she rounded the corner, whether she was tired, or happy, or carrying something heavy. He learned that she hummed when she was concentrating, and went silent when she was sad, and that the silence came more often than he liked, usually in the evenings, usually when the light went long and gold through the greenhouse glass, and something in her seemed to remember, all at once, that she was alone. He started sleeping closer on those nights. Not because a wolf needed warmth. Because some part of him, still learning the shape of what he wanted, had decided that, if he lay close enough, the silence might not reach her at all. The bathing incident happened on a Tuesday. He would remember it, later, as the exact moment his entire life ceased to be under his control. She came home, from the nursery smelling like peat moss and rooting hormone, took one look at him and announced, with the flat authority of a woman who wrestled 50-pound soil bags for a living and was not remotely intimidated by anything with fur, that he smelled, to put it charitably, like a swamp that had recently caught fire. And that they were both getting clean before dinner. He weighed this information. He was the alpha king of the Black Mire Dominion. He got in the tub. She scrubbed behind his ears with her fingernails. She'd gone to the pet store on her lunch break, her actual lunch break, spent on him, and asked what shampoo was gentle for sensitive skin, and come back with something that smelled like oatmeal and honey, and she talked the entire time. Low. Easy. About her day, about Hollis grunting something that might have been approval, about a lavender cutting that had finally shown root nubs after weeks of nothing. Her hands moved along his ribs. Careful around the healing wound. Patient the way she was patient, with everything, plants and strays and, apparently, wolves who'd shown up bleeding in her yard. And then she pulled him in close to rinse behind his ears, his massive head cradled against her shoulder, and the scent of her skin hit him at close range, crushed mint, warm earth, something underneath that was purely, unmistakably her, and a single word detonated through his entire body with the force of a physical blow. Mate. Every muscle he had went rigid. She felt it instantly. Pulled back, already scanning his side, hands hovering over the wound. Did I hurt you? Is it the stitches? Let me look. He was not hurt. He was ruined. He let her towel him off, with a beach towel that had cartoon starfish printed on it. He stood in a cramped bathroom, dripping, utterly undone, while a small Omega woman dabbed at his ears, and told him, with genuine tenderness, that his fur was so shiny now, look at you, so handsome. He had fought in 3 territorial wars. He had taken his throne at 22 by killing his own uncle in ritual combat, in front of a crowd of 300 wolves, who had watched, and not one of whom had dared look away. He was currently being complimented on his shiny fur, with cartoon starfish pressed against his face, and some deep animal part of him, the part he usually kept leashed, with iron discipline, was, in fact, genuinely pleased about it. He put his head, metaphorically, in his hands. There was no coming back from this. The gift started with a rabbit. Not a dead one. He had some dignity left, even now. A live one, plump and terrified, which he cornered near the creek, after several deeply undignified sprints, through underbrush that no alpha king should ever be caught doing, and herded, with great effort, onto her front porch. She opened the door, and found a rabbit sitting in frozen terror beside a wolf, who looked, despite himself, almost proud. She laughed. Really laughed, the kind that made her sit down hard on the porch steps, one hand pressed to her chest. "Oh, Shadow. Did you bring me a friend?" She examined the rabbit. Found it unharmed. Released it into the brush, with a gentle nudge and a murmured apology. That was very sweet, she told him, scratching behind his ears the way that made his hind leg twitch, a fact he found deeply humiliating and never once stopped her from doing. "But we don't kidnap rabbits. Okay?" The next night he brought her wild sage, bitten free from a hillside, without crushing a single stem. She stared at it. Then at him. Then back at the sage, very slowly, like she was working through a math problem that refused to resolve. "Did you," she said, "bring me herbs?" He sat very straight and said nothing, because wolves could not say anything, and there was a small, undignified mercy in that. She put the sage in a jar on her windowsill and kissed the top of his head. "You," she informed him, "are the strangest animal I have ever met." It was, without question, the finest compliment he'd received in 8 years on the throne. After the sage came a smooth river stone the exact pale green of her eyes. Then honeycomb, stolen from a wild hive at the cost of 11 separate bee stings, which she discovered still stuck to his muzzle, when he presented it to her, with the solemn dignity of a man delivering a decree of state. She spent 20 minutes picking dead bees out of his fur with tweezers. Scolding him. Laughing. The sound of her laughter became, without his permission, without his consent, the single thing he would have traded his throne to keep hearing. There were quieter gifts too, the ones she never noticed as gifts at all. The nights he stayed awake, so she wouldn't have to wake alone, if the nightmares came, and they did come more often than she ever admitted out loud. The mornings he positioned himself at the door, before she'd finished her coffee, so that whatever waited outside, deliverymen, stray dogs, the occasional wandering alpha scouting gray mist territory, who got close enough to smell an omega living unclaimed and unprotected, understood immediately, without a word exchanged, that this particular fence line was not undefended. He never told her why he did it. She never asked. Some part of her, he suspected, already knew. Bastion found him at the end of the first week. He appeared at the edge of the tree line in human form, arms crossed, wearing the specific expression of a man who has spent 7 days searching for his king, and found, instead, several new and troubling reasons to reconsider his life choices. "My king," Bastion said, through his teeth. "You have been missing for 7 days. We found blood at the ambush site. Commander Ilsa has put the Eastern Division on war footing. The Council is drafting emergency succession protocols, and you are." He looked past Draven's shoulder. At the potting shed. At the greenhouse glowing warm through the trees. Hiding in a greenhouse. "I am conducting surveillance," Draven said, also through his teeth, because he'd shifted behind a tree specifically to have this conversation, and the November air on bare skin was deeply unpleasant. "The gray mist border is strategically significant." Bastion's eyes narrowed. "You smell like oatmeal." "The border," Draven repeated, with the particular flat authority of a king, who was not going to be moved on this point, "is strategically significant." Bastion looked at him for a long moment. Long enough that Draven felt, uncomfortably, that his oldest friend, and most loyal soldier could see straight, through 30 years of trained composure, into something raw and new and frankly ridiculous underneath. "Stand down the Eastern Division," Draven said finally. "Tell the Council I'm on classified reconnaissance. And bring me clothes." Bastion did all three things. With the silent, suffering efficiency of a man who knew exactly what was happening and had made the strategic decision not to say a single word about it out loud. Not yet, anyway. He did add one thing, though, low, almost to himself, before he turned to go. "You have not looked this calm in 8 years, my king. Whatever that woman is doing to you, I suggest you figure out how to keep it." Draven did not answer. He filed the comment away in the same place he filed everything he did not yet know how to feel about, and told himself he would deal with it later. Clothed. In human form. Draven told himself he was simply going to observe. Confirm what the wolf already knew. See her as a man sees a woman, weigh it with a clear head, and then he'd make a rational decision, the kind he'd made for 8 years running a dominion, through unbroken peace, the kind that didn't involve rabbits, or shampoo, or scrambled eggs eaten off a plate on a greenhouse floor. He walked to the nursery. He told himself he was verifying her identity. For strategic purposes. He pushed open the door of Greenhouse 4, and found her at a propagation bench, hair pinned up in a knot, that was already coming loose, hands dusted with perlite, slicing a stem at a precise 45-degree angle, with a razor blade. Talking to it. Quietly. Seriously. "Come on," she murmured, holding the cutting up to the light, studying it like it mattered, like it was listening. "You've got 2 good eyes on this section. You can do this. I believe in you." Then she looked up. Saw him standing in the doorway. The blade slipped. Nicked her thumb. "Oh," she said, blinking at the small bright line of blood. "Oh." Then, to him, distracted, apologetic, "Sorry. Are you looking for Hollis?" "He's in the office," Draven said. Which was not what he'd meant to say. He'd meant to say something composed. Something appropriately regal. Instead he'd apparently absorbed, over the course of 1 week, the exact daily schedule of a man he'd never met. "Probably," she said. "Unless he's hiding from the sales rep again. Try the parking lot. He sits in his truck and pretends he isn't there." Blood was welling from her thumb. He crossed the greenhouse in 3 strides, before he'd made a conscious decision to move, took her hand, pressed his own thumb against the cut to stop the bleeding. The touch sent something through him he felt in his teeth. She went very still. Stared down at their joined hands. Then up at him. Up close, her eyes were the pale, startling green of new growth on a willow branch. "You," she said slowly, "have very intense eyes. Has anyone ever told you that?" He'd been told many things about his eyes. That they were frightening. That they could silence a room of 300 wolves, without a word. That they were the color of molten iron, and just as unforgiving. Nobody had ever said intense like it was a neutral observation about the weather. Like the single most powerful alpha on the continent was just a man, with notably vivid eye color who'd wandered into her greenhouse and grabbed her hand without asking. "I'm Draven," he said. Which was, on its face, a fairly ordinary sentence. It cost him more effort than anything he'd said in years. "Okay," she said, and glanced pointedly down. "You can let go of my thumb now." He did not want to let go of her thumb. He let go of her thumb. After that, he found reasons to return. The nursery, he told Bastion, needed a large order of native species for a border restoration project. This required site visits. Multiple site visits. He toured the greenhouses asking about soil pH and root development, with the intensity of a man conducting treaty negotiations, and Wren watched him do it, with an expression that suggested she couldn't quite decide if it was flattering or alarming. He held doors for her, with the rigid, learned courtesy of a man who'd absorbed manners from a military etiquette manual and never once applied them to a woman he actually wanted to impress. When she made jokes, he didn't laugh, but something happened in his jaw, a tightening, a small betrayal that suggested laughter was occurring somewhere internally and being suppressed by sheer force of will. He didn't know how to talk to her. Not the way the wolf knew. The wolf could lie beside her on the greenhouse floor and press his nose against her neck and simply breathe her in, and she'd laugh and push at his massive head and say, "You're ridiculous," and it was easy. It was the simplest thing in the world. But standing 3 feet away from her in human form, discussing container gardening like it was a matter of state, that he did not know how to do. She talked to Shadow about it. Of course she did. She talked to Shadow about everything. "There's this man who keeps coming by the nursery," she told him one night, lying on her bed, with one arm draped over the wolf on the floor beside her. "I think he might be the most awkward person I've ever met." A pause. "He bought 47 trays of lavender starts today." 47. He'd counted them himself. Stood in the greenhouse office and watched Hollis ring them up one at a time, tray after tray, while some deranged part of his brain insisted this was a reasonable, defensible, strategically sound purchase. "What is anyone going to do?" Wren asked the ceiling, "with 47 trays of lavender?" Shadow, on the floor, stared at the wall, with the fixed intensity of a man who had, in fact, just ordered enough lavender to plant across half his eastern territory, and was now going to have to explain that to somebody. She rolled onto her side, looked down at him. Her hand found the spot behind his ear that made his hind leg twitch. "He's sort of beautiful, actually. In a scary way. Like a hawk. You know how hawks look, like they're either going to eat you or completely ignore you, and both options are equally terrifying." His wolf made a sound that was not quite a growl and not quite a whine. "But he's also," she went on, softer now, the way her voice went when she was being honest about something fragile, "he's also sort of careful. Like he's holding everything in, all the time. Like he's afraid he'll break something if he doesn't." She was quiet a moment. "I know what that feels like," she said. "Holding yourself still so you don't bother anyone. Making yourself small, so nobody has a reason to push you out." He closed his eyes. Her hand kept moving. Slow. Absent. Rhythmic. "I told a cutting I believed in it today," she said, and laughed quietly at herself. "It's a plant. Not a person. Hollis thinks I'm insane." A breath. "Maybe I am." Another breath, this one smaller. "Maybe I'm just lonely, Shadow. Maybe that's all it is." He pressed his head harder into her hand. She curled her fingers into his fur, and they stayed like that until her breathing evened out into sleep, and he lay there in the dark, wide awake, understanding with total clarity that he was not going to survive this. Not the ambush. Not the wound. This. 3 miles east, in a stone hall that had once been a monastery, and now served as the war chamber of the Blackmire Dominion, Bastian stood over a table covered in maps and reports nobody else was allowed to read. One report in particular. He'd pulled it himself, quietly, without telling the council, because something about the ambush had never sat right with him. The rogues who'd hit Draven's border patrol had known the patrol schedule. Known the rotation. Known, specifically, which route carried the king's personal guard on that exact night, information that existed in exactly one place. The War Council's internal ledger. Which meant somebody inside the Blackmire Dominion, somebody with access to that ledger, somebody who sat at that table and called Draven my king to his face, had handed Rurik Vane's people everything they needed to nearly kill him. Bastian stared at the ledger for a long time. Then he closed it. Locked it in the drawer, where he kept things too dangerous to say out loud yet. Because he had no proof. Not yet. Just a feeling, cold and certain, sitting low in his gut the way it always did right, before something got very bad. He thought about Draven, 3 miles west, lying on some stranger's greenhouse floor pretending to be a stray dog. Go ahead, he thought, not without some fondness. Have your eggs. Have your rabbit. But somebody in this hall wants you dead, my king. And they are patient enough to wait until you come home. The prince arrived 2 weeks later, and everything got worse. His name was Soren Larkspur, second son of the Ashwick territory, and Draven had known him by reputation for years, tall, easy smiling, the kind of effortless charm that Draven had always found faintly suspicious in other men, mostly because he himself had never once possessed it. Ashwick had been negotiating a trade alliance with the Blackmire Dominion for the better part of a year, and Soren had come to the Grey Mist border, ostensibly, to inspect the disputed territory that was, in theory, the subject of Draven's entirely fabricated reconnaissance mission. He found Ren within 40 minutes of arriving. Draven was on her porch in wolf form, dozing in a patch of thin autumn sun, when Soren's convoy, sleek, black, entirely too polished for a border inspection, pulled up outside the nursery across the road. Draven watched through half-closed eyes, as the prince climbed out, stretched, and strolled into Greenhouse 4, with the casual entitlement of a man who believed every room improved the moment he entered it. Through the open door, Draven heard him say something. Couldn't quite make out the words. Then he heard Ren laugh. Not the low, private laugh she gave Shadow. A real laugh. Bright. Surprised. The laugh of a woman who wasn't used to being charmed and had been caught completely off guard by it. Something old and dark moved through Draven's chest. His claws extended into the porch boards. The wood groaned under the pressure. He should not have watched. He watched anyway. Pressed his nose against the greenhouse glass like some lovesick juvenile, while Soren leaned against the propagation bench, easy and unbothered, making her laugh 3 more times. Watched him pick up a cutting, ask her to show him how to make a clean cut. Watched her take his hand to demonstrate the angle. Mine, his wolf snarled, and the word tore through him with enough force to raise every hair along his spine. When Soren left, Draven was sitting on the porch, with an expression Ren, coming outside a few minutes later, read entirely wrong. Oh, Shadow. She knelt, took his massive head in both hands. Were you lonely? I'm sorry. I got distracted. A pause. Her teeth caught her lower lip. He was nice. Really nice, actually. Another pause, this one longer. He asked if I wanted to get coffee sometime. Draven stared at her. I said yes, she added, and looked, for one unguarded second, genuinely bewildered by her own life. Can you believe that? Nobody asks me to get coffee. That night, he ate one of her gardening gloves. Not on purpose. Not exactly. His wolf had simply located the glove near the door, and made an executive decision that it needed to die, and Draven, in the moment, had found himself entirely unwilling to argue with the decision. Ren found the shredded remains the next morning, and scolded him, with the weary affection of a woman who had accepted, some time ago, that her life now included a wolf, with an inexplicable vendetta against accessories. You, she told him, holding up the ruined glove, are a menace. He did not disagree. 200 miles south, in a great timber hall that smelled of pine resin and old smoke, a woman named Corvine sat alone at the head of an empty council table, reading a report by lamplight. Corvine ran the Grey Mist pack the way she ran everything, with the efficiency of a corporate executive and the warmth of a February mortgage statement. Every decision she'd ever made was defensible on paper. Every cruelty she'd ever committed had been, technically, an accident of administration. The report in front of her was 3 years old. It concerned a girl named Ren Sorrel, whose mother had died, whose father had been human and long forgotten, and whose registry file had simply lapsed. No confrontation. No dramatic scene. A form that was never filed, by an office that never called back. Corvine had signed off on that lapse herself. Not because the girl had done anything wrong. Because the girl's mother had carried something in her blood, something old, something Corvine had spent 30 years making sure the wider wolf world forgot existed. A bloodline the history books called seedbound, back when anyone still bothered writing about it at all. The kind of blood that made plants grow where they shouldn't. That healed wounds no medicine should be able to touch. The kind of blood that, if certain territories ever learned it still existed, would turn a quiet, harmless nursery worker into the single most valuable and most dangerous asset on the continent. Corvine had erased her instead. Efficient. Defensible. Quiet. She closed the file. Poured herself a drink she didn't particularly want. 3 years, she thought, and the girl had stayed exactly where she'd been put. Small. Unbothered. Unnoticed. Until, apparently, an alpha king had crawled into her greenhouse and refused to leave. Corvine allowed herself a single, humorless smile. Well, she thought. That complicates things. She sat with the file a while longer, turning it over the way she turned over every problem, looking for the angle that cost her the least. Wolves were, in her long experience, predictable in exactly one way. They wanted what they could not have, and once they had it, they would burn down anything standing between them and keeping it. If the Alpha King of the Black Mire Dominion had attached himself to a seedbound Omega, then the smartest move available to Corvine was not to hide the girl further. It was to make certain that whatever happened next happened on Corvine's terms, in Corvine's hall, in front of witnesses Corvine controlled. She began drafting the letter that same night, though she would not send it for several more days yet, turning the wording over the way a careful woman turns over a blade, before deciding exactly where to place the first cut. In human form, he handled it with even less composure. He arrived at the nursery the morning of Wren's coffee date and ordered 1,200 native ferns. A quantity that made Bastion, handling the logistics from 3 miles away, send back a single text message that consisted entirely of the word Y, lowercase, no punctuation. Draven found the message insubordinate. He did not respond to it. You seem tense, Wren observed, potting up a tray of rooted cuttings with quick, practiced precision, tucking each small plant into its cell with a firm, gentle press of her thumbs. I am not tense, Draven said, tensely. Okay, she said, in the agreeable tone of a woman who did not believe him and was too polite to argue about it. She glanced up. Are you sure you need 1,200 ferns? That's a lot of ferns. The restoration project requires extensive ground cover. There was, of course, no restoration project. There was, at this point, 47 trays of lavender and 1,200 ferns that Bastion had been forced to distribute across the eastern military bases, resulting in several deeply confused battalion commanders receiving unexplained shipments of shrubbery, with no note attached. Wren went on the coffee date. Draven sat in his truck across the street for the entire duration. Wearing sunglasses. Indoors, effectively, in his own vehicle, in October, like a man who had lost every last shred of dignity he'd ever possessed, and was choosing, apparently, to lose it in a parked truck outside a coffee shop. He watched through the window, as Soren leaned across the table, said something Draven would never hear, something that made Wren cover her mouth, with one hand, and look down, cheeks flushing the same pink as the geraniums she grew in her kitchen window. It destroyed him. Not because she was happy. Because she was happy, and it wasn't him who'd made her that way. He drove back to the tree line afterward, and shifted and ran until his lungs burned, because there was nothing else to do with what was sitting in his chest, and running had always been the one thing that emptied him out enough to think straight. It did not work this time. He came back to himself an hour later, exhausted, no clearer than when he'd started, and understood dimly, unwillingly, that this particular problem could not be outrun. That evening, as Shadow, he did something he shouldn't have. Wren was on the porch in the last of the autumn light, a second-hand paperback, with a cracked spine forgotten in her lap, her socked feet resting on his back like he was furniture. Which, by now, he essentially was. This was normal. This was every evening. Then she set the book down. Sighed. He was really nice, Shadow, she said quietly. Soren. The prince. A pause. He was funny. Easy to talk to. He didn't make me feel like I was taking up too much space. She pulled her knees up, wrapped her arms around them. Looked, suddenly, very small. But there's something. Her hand pressed flat against her own sternum. I don't know. There's something in my chest that keeps pulling. Like a compass. And it's not pointing at him. Draven stopped breathing. She looked at him, eyes glassy in the fading light. Am I broken? She asked. Not really asking him. Asking the universe, or herself, or the unnamed emptiness that lived in the space where a pack bond should have been. Is there something wrong with me that I can't just be happy when someone nice shows up? That I keep wanting something I can't even name? He rose off the porch floor. All 180 pounds of him, wound half-healed, restraint fraying at every seam. Pushed his head under her arm. She made a sound, half laugh, half sob, and wrapped both arms around his neck, buried her face in his fur. Tell her, his human mind said. Not yet, he answered himself. Not like this. She doesn't know what she'd be agreeing to. She doesn't know who you are. Then who does she love? Some colder, quieter voice asked back. He didn't answer that one. His body curled around her instead, tail wrapping across her lap, and he held himself there, as the sun went down, and the cold crept in, and he did not leave. He would not leave. Back at the nursery, none of that had reached Wren yet. She didn't know about the file. Didn't know about the blood in her veins, that made cuttings root faster than they should, made dying things stubbornly, inexplicably decide to live. She just knew that a stray wolf had wandered into her life 3 weeks ago, and refused to leave, and that some careful, awkward man kept showing up asking about soil pH, with an intensity that made no sense for a stranger, and that both of them, somehow, in ways she couldn't name yet, felt like the first solid ground she'd stood on in 3 years. She sat on the porch, that night long, after Shadow had finally drifted into sleep beside her, his breathing slow, and even against her side, and looked up at a sky gone hard, and clear and full of stars, and said, very quietly, to nobody at all. I don't know what's happening to me. The wolf, half asleep, pressed closer. She didn't know it yet. But somewhere 3 miles east, a man was staring at a locked drawer full of evidence he wasn't ready to use. Somewhere 200 miles south, a woman was closing a file on a bloodline she'd spent 3 years pretending didn't exist. And somewhere out past the tree line, in the wild dark beyond her fence, a wolf named Rurik Vane was watching her greenhouse glow gold against the night, patient, waiting, already counting down the days, until everything she thought she knew about her own quiet life came apart. She just felt the pull in her chest. She didn't know, yet, that it was pointing toward all of it at once. The weeks that followed did not get easier. They got worse in the specific, humiliating way that only a man used to controlling every variable in his life could find worse. Because Draven Ashwood had commanded armies. He had negotiated treaties that ended wars before they started. He had once talked a rival alpha out of a blood feud using nothing but silence and the correct amount of eye contact. None of that prepared him for this. For standing in a nursery parking lot at 7 in the morning, arguing with himself about whether 400 trays of native wildflower seed was a reasonable follow-up purchase to 47 trays of lavender and 1,200 ferns. It was not reasonable. He bought them anyway. Because Hollis had started looking at him differently. Not suspicious, exactly. Worse than suspicious. Amused. The old man had taken to leaning against the register whenever Draven walked in, arms crossed, watching him browse seed packets, with the flat, patient expression of a man who had seen every kind of fool walk through his doors, and had finally, after decades, found the strangest one yet. "Restoration project," Hollis said one morning. "Not a question." A statement, delivered with the exact weight of a man setting down a very heavy, very obvious fact on a table between them. "Yes," Draven said. "Big project. Extensive." Hollis nodded slowly. Rang up $600 of wildflower seed, without further comment. Which was, somehow, worse than if he'd said something. Because the old man knew. Everybody knew. Except Ren. That was the part that ate at him. Not the money he could burn through a season's nursery inventory 100 times over without denting the Black Mire treasury. Not the lie itself, even, though the lie sat in his chest now like a swallowed stone, heavier every single day. It was that everyone around her seemed to understand what was happening except the one person it was actually happening to. He watched her some mornings, from across the greenhouse, sorting cuttings with quick, sure hands, humming something off-key, utterly unaware that the man 3 benches over ordering ground cover for a border project that did not exist was also the wolf currently sleeping in the corner of her bedroom. 2 men. Same face, technically. Same heart, definitely. But she talked to one of them like a person, and the other one like a secret she was keeping from herself, and Draven had started to feel, most days, like he was slowly disappearing into the gap between the two. Which was insane. Which was, objectively, an insane thing for the alpha king of a 4-territory dominion to be losing sleep over. Except he was. He lay awake most nights now, in wolf form on the floor, her arm draped over his ribs, running the math the way he ran every problem. Options. Consequences. Outcomes. Tell her. She screams. She calls the authorities, not that authorities existed, who could do anything about an alpha king, but she'd try, because that's what a person did, when they discovered they'd been lied to for a month by something wearing their trust like a coat. She never speaks to him again. Best case. Worst case, she looks at him the way the Greymist registry office had looked at her 3 years ago. Like a mistake somebody forgot to correct. Don't tell her. Then this continues. The lying continues. The 2 men continue splitting further and further apart, until one of them, probably the human one, the one with the crown, and the war council, and the 1,200 ferns nobody needed, simply stops existing in her world at all. Neither option worked. So he did the third thing, the coward's thing, the thing he told himself was strategic patience, and which Bastion, when he finally said it out loud one gray afternoon at the tree line, called something considerably less flattering. "You're stalling," Bastion said. "I'm managing a delicate situation." "You're stalling." Draven said nothing. Bastion exhaled through his nose, the particular sound of a man who had known his king since they were both pups fighting over scraps of meat in the training yard, and who had therefore earned, through 3 decades of loyalty, the right to say the thing nobody else would. "My king," he said, quieter now. "I have watched you take a throne by killing your own blood in front of 300 witnesses without blinking. I have watched you sit across a table from men who wanted you dead and talk them into peace instead." A pause. "I have never, not once, seen you scared." Draven's jaw tightened. "You're scared now," Bastion said. It wasn't a question either. "Yes," Draven said, finally. The word cost him something to say. It always did. "I am." Bastion nodded slowly, like he'd expected exactly that answer and had simply needed to hear it said out loud, before he could move on to the next thing. "Good," he said. "Now that we've established that. There's something else you need to know. And it's worse than the girl." Bastion had pulled the ambush ledger 3 separate times over the past 2 weeks, ever since the night Soren Larkspur's convoy had first rolled into grey mist territory, and Bastian's instincts, already restless, had sharpened into something closer to certainty. Each time, alone. Each time, after the war council had gone home for the night, in the stone hall, that smelled of old smoke and older secrets, with the door locked and a single candle burning, because he didn't trust himself to say any of this out loud in a lit room, where the walls might be listening. The pattern was simple, once you saw it. That was the horrifying part. It had been sitting there in plain columns and plain numbers for weeks, and nobody had looked, because nobody had reason to suspect that the rot was already inside the house. Patrol schedules. Route assignments. The specific rotation that had put Draven's personal guard on, that exact stretch of border on, that exact night. All of it logged in one place. The council ledger. Which meant the leak wasn't some outside spy who'd gotten lucky. It wasn't Rurik Vane's people doing clever reconnaissance from the tree line. It was someone who sat at the war table. Someone who'd looked Draven in the eye at every single council meeting for the past 2 weeks, and called him my king, with a straight face, while quietly bleeding his own dominion's secrets out the back door. Bastian narrowed it down to 4 names. Then 2. Then, on a wet Tuesday night, staring at a signature on a supply requisition that didn't match the date it claimed to have been filed, he narrowed it down to 1. Elder Castellan Veer. 70 years old. 30 of them spent on the war council. A man who'd stood at Draven's coronation and sworn an oath, so old the words had worn smooth from centuries of repetition. Bastian sat with that name for a long time. Because it made no sense on its face. Veer had no obvious motive. No debts, no grudges, nothing in his file that explained why a man who'd served 3 kings would suddenly decide to sell information to a rogue alpha with a blood feud against the throne. Unless it wasn't about Rurik at all. Unless Rurik was just the tool somebody else was using. That thought sat in Bastian's chest like a stone all night, and by morning he'd made a decision he would, later, deeply regret making alone. He was going to confront Veer himself. Quietly. Off the record. Give the old man one chance to explain himself, before this went any further up the chain. He should have told Draven first. He would think about that mistake for a very long time. The confrontation happened in Veer's private chambers, 2 nights later, and nobody but the 2 of them ever heard exactly what was said. What Bastian reported back, what little he managed to report back, was this: Veer had gone pale the moment Bastian laid the requisition sheet on the table between them. Pale, then very still, in the specific way of a man who has spent years successfully hiding something, and has just watched the hiding stop working. "It's not what you think," Veer had said. "Then tell me what it is," Bastian had answered. And Veer had opened his mouth to do exactly that, but Bastian was sure of it, sure enough to stake his own honor on it later, when the window behind him shattered inward, and something fast and silent crossed the room, and by the time Bastian got his weapon up, Elder Castellan Veer was already on the floor, with a blade through his throat and nothing left to explain. The killer was gone before Bastian reached the window. No trace. No scent trail that led anywhere but into the wind. Professional. Efficient. The kind of kill that told you more about the person who'd ordered it than the person who'd carried it out. Somebody had known Veer was about to talk. Somebody had been listening. Which meant the leak wasn't just one old man with a guilty conscience. It was bigger than that. Deeper. Rooted somewhere Bastian hadn't found yet, and now the one man, who might have named names, was lying dead on his own chamber floor, and the only thing Bastian had to show for 2 weeks of quiet, careful investigation was a body, and a question with no answer. Who silenced him? And why? He told Draven everything the next morning, standing at the tree line in the cold, both of them in human form, both of them very still. Draven listened without interrupting. That was, Bastian had always thought, one of the more underrated things about his king. He let a report finish before he reacted to it, even when every muscle in his body was clearly screaming to react immediately. When Bastian finished, Draven was quiet for a long moment. "You confronted him alone," he said finally. "Yes." "Without telling me?" "Yes." "That was a mistake." "I know," Bastian said. "No defense in it. Just the flat acknowledgement of a soldier who'd made a call and watched it go wrong, and wasn't going to pretend otherwise to save face. I thought I could handle it quietly. I was wrong. He's dead because I was wrong." Draven looked out at the tree line for a long time. At the gray morning light filtering down, through branches gone bare, with the season. "Somebody inside my own council tried to have me killed," he said, slowly, like he was testing the shape of the sentence for the first time. "And when we got close to finding out who, somebody else killed the evidence, before it could talk." "Yes." "Which means there's more than one." "Yes." Draven's hands closed into fists at his sides. Not dramatically. Just quietly, the way a man's hands close, when he's holding something back by pure force of will. "Find them," he said. "I'm trying." "Try harder." A pause. Something in his voice cracked open, just slightly, just enough for Bastian to hear the man underneath the king. "Because if this is what it looks like, if somebody inside my own house wants me dead badly enough to kill an old man in his own chambers to keep him quiet, then everyone I care about is a target the moment they find out about them." Bastian went very still. Because he understood, immediately, exactly who Draven meant. Not the War Council. Not the Dominion's officers, not the 4 territories, not the 12 war packs currently waiting for a king, who kept disappearing for days at a time. A woman with dirt under her fingernails, 3 miles west, who had no idea any of this existed. "You need to tell her," Bastian said. "Quiet. Careful. Soon. Before this finds her the way it found Vyre." Draven closed his eyes. "I know," he said. He did not go tell her that day. He told himself there wasn't a right moment yet. He would spend a long time, later, wishing he'd made one. Ren got sick on a Thursday. Not sick like a cold. Sick like the world tilting sideways, sick like light, through her own curtains turning, into something jagged and physical, a migraine that had been building behind her left eye, since noon and finally broke open around 6 in the evening, while she was still at the nursery, hands full of perlite, vision suddenly fractured, into a pulsing grid of white noise. She made it home. Barely. She texted Draven to cancel their planned walk along the fern planting sites that did not exist, that Bastian had invented out of thin air to justify the shipment, though she had no idea of that yet, and then she closed every curtain in the house, and crawled into bed, with a damp cloth over her eyes, and lay very still, waiting for the pain to pass, or for the world to end. Either one, at that point, felt equally likely. Shadow was there within the hour. He was always there now. Appearing at her door, as the sun went down, with the reliability of a tide, and she had long since stopped wondering where he went during the day. Wolves were territorial. He probably had a range, a circuit, whatever wolves did. She didn't question it. Because questioning it might make him leave, and some quiet, desperate part of her could not bear that thought, not tonight, not with her skull feeling like it had been cracked open and left in the sun. He nosed the bedroom door open. Found her curled on her side, whimpering softly into the pillow, and something in the room's air had gone sharp and wrong, that acrid chemical smell pain seems to produce, cutting straight through her usual scent of mint and warm earth like a wire, through soft wood. He whined low in his throat. Then he did something he had never once done before. He jumped onto the bed, without waiting for permission, curled his massive body around her back, a wall of warmth, and weight and pressure, and she didn't push him away. She turned into him instead, pressed her face against his chest, cold hands fisting in the thick fur of his belly, and he could feel the thready, frantic pound of her pulse against his ribs. "Stay," she whispered. Just stay. He would have stayed through a siege. He would have stayed through a war. Which was, in fact, more or less exactly what was happening, a war, quiet and unseen, closing in around the edges of both their lives, except neither of them knew that yet, and for one suspended hour it didn't matter. Because the warmth of her. Because the desperate grip of her hands. Because the way she pressed herself into him like she was trying to climb inside the safety of his body, all of it triggered something primal in him, ungovernable, older than his own careful discipline. The mate bond flared. Not as emotion this time. As biology. A physical current rippling through his wolf form like electricity through water. His body began to shift. The bones in his forelimbs crackled. Fur along his spine rippled, thinning. He clenched every muscle he had, forced the shift to stop, through sheer furious will, and it was like trying to hold back a river with his bare hands. His jaw lengthened. Snapped back. Claws retracted. Emerged. Retracted again. For 30 agonizing seconds he existed in the space between forms, neither fully wolf, nor fully man, while the woman in his arms lay against him, and felt nothing but warmth, nothing but the animal she thought she knew holding her together, through the worst of the pain. He held the shift. Forced his body back into shape by pure, furious will, and when it was finally done his whole frame was trembling, so hard the bed frame shook against the wall. Ren stirred. Shadow. Are you cold? He pressed his nose against the top of her head. She smelled like mint and salt and everything he wanted. She settled back against him. Her breathing evened out into sleep. And the Alpha King lay rigid behind her in the dark, heart-hammering, staring at the ceiling, understanding with absolute clarity that he was out of time. He could not keep doing this. The dual life was collapsing under its own weight, and every moment in wolf form was borrowed now, stolen, and every moment in human form felt insufficient by comparison, and the space between the two was filling up fast, with a lie that grew heavier every single night. He would tell her. Soon. He told himself that with total conviction, lying in the dark, with her arm across his ribs, and he almost believed it. 200 miles south, Corvine sat alone in her private study, with a second drink she also didn't particularly want, and made a decision that would set the rest of the season in motion. She'd known about the seed-bound blood for 3 years. She'd erased Ren Sorrel from the registry not out of malice, exactly. Corvine did very little out of malice, as a rule, malice being an inefficient use of energy, but out of a cold, practical understanding of what would happen the moment the wider wolf world learned that a working bloodline still existed. Every territory on the continent would want her. Some would want her protected. More would want her controlled, or bred, or simply removed, as a variable, before a rival dominion could claim her first. Corvine had judged, 3 years ago, that the safest place for that kind of blood was nowhere at all. A quiet nursery. An unremarkable life. A girl nobody looked twice at. It had worked, more or less, for 3 years. Then an Alpha King had crawled bleeding into her greenhouse and refused to leave, and now half the intelligence networks on the continent were starting to notice that the Black Mire Dominion's ruler had gone quiet for weeks at a time, disappearing into Grey Mist territory, with no official explanation, and Corvine, who made her living reading exactly this kind of pattern, had drawn the obvious conclusion almost immediately. He knew something. Or he'd found something. Or, more likely, he'd simply fallen for the girl the way men occasionally did, without any understanding at all of what they'd actually stumbled into. Which meant the secret Corvine had spent 3 years burying was about to surface whether she wanted it to or not. So she made her decision the way she made all her decisions. Not out of cruelty. Out of leverage. If the girl's value was about to become public regardless, then Corvine intended to be the one who controlled how, when, and to whose benefit. She drafted a letter that night. Formal reinstatement of registry status, full restoration of pack rights, and healer access, an invitation, an obligation, really, dressed up as an invitation, to attend the Greymist Autumn Summit, as an eligible Omega, available for formal courtship declarations. She read it over once. Twice. Then she signed it, sealed it, and sent it out, with the morning courier, and told herself, the way she told herself most things, that this was simply good administration. A line item, balanced at last. She did not let herself think too hard about the fact that the girl she was about to parade in front of every alpha in the region like livestock at a county fair had spent 3 years alone, because of a decision Corvine herself had made, and never once revisited. Efficient. Defensible. She poured the rest of the drink out untouched, and went to bed. The letter arrived 4 days later. Wren was at the kitchen table, when she opened it, cutting shears still in one hand, from the afternoon's work, and she read it twice, before the words fully landed, and then she set it down very carefully on the table like it might go off, if she moved too fast. Shadow, lying across the kitchen doorway, watched her go still. "It's from the Greymist pack," she said, eventually. Her voice had gone strange. Flat. Carefully, deliberately even, the way her voice went, when it was very much not neutral at all. "After 3 years. A short, humorless laugh. "After 3 years, they want me to come to the summit. As an eligible Omega." She looked up at nothing. At the middle distance. At 3 years of silence suddenly, inexplicably, ending. "I think Soren did something," she said slowly. "Pulled some strings. He's like that, he just does things, because they're right, and he doesn't think about the politics underneath them." A breath. "But Corvine doesn't do anything without politics." She set the letter down flat on the table, and smoothed it, with one hand, like smoothing it might make it less real. "So either I show up," she said, "and let them use me, as a bargaining chip for whatever this actually is. Or I refuse. And give them the exact excuse they need to say I chose to leave, all those years ago, instead of admitting they were the ones who threw the paperwork away." Draven, Shadow, in that moment, was still Shadow, and would remain Shadow for a few more critical days, crossed the kitchen, and pressed his head against her leg. She sank down onto the floor beside him. Wrapped both arms around his neck. "Sometimes I think you're the only one who actually chose me," she said quietly, into his fur. "You just showed up. And stayed. No conditions. No forms. No registry." He closed his eyes. The words landed exactly where she'd aimed them, whether she knew it or not, straight into the center of everything he was hiding from her. "I wish," she stopped. Swallowed. Started again. "I wish I could explain this thing in my chest. This pulling. It's gotten worse lately." She pressed her fist against her sternum. "Like something's trying to come home. And I don't know how to open the door." The mate bond. She was feeling it now, unmistakably, incomplete and unnamed, and one-sided as far as she knew, but there, pulling at her like a current she couldn't see, and had no name for. He understood her perfectly. He said nothing, because he could say nothing, and the silence between them sat there in the kitchen like a third presence, patient, waiting, exactly as heavy as the lie that had built it. The visitor came 2 nights before the summit, and he did not come the way Draven would have expected an enemy to come. Wren was locking up Greenhouse 4, later than usual, the nursery gone dark and quiet around her, moths bumping soft against the last working light, when she felt it, before she saw it. That specific prickle at the back of the neck, that means you are not alone in a place you thought was empty. She turned. A man stood at the edge of the gravel lot, just past the reach of the light. Tall. Lean in the specific, hard way of someone who has spent years surviving on very little. A face like cracked leather, and eyes that tracked her, with a flat, careful calculation that should have frightened her far more than it did. "You're not supposed to be here," she said. Steady. Careful. her hand already drifting toward the pruning shears on the bench behind her, more out of instinct than any real belief they'd help. No, the man agreed. I'm not. Who are you? He was quiet for a moment, considering the question, or considering how much of the answer she could handle. Someone who owes the Black Mire Dominion a great deal of pain, he said finally. And someone who's about to collect it, one way or another, whether you're standing near it or not. Ren's stomach dropped. I don't know what that means. I know you don't. His voice softened just slightly, an odd thing coming from a man who otherwise looked built entirely out of old grievances. That's why I'm here. Not to hurt you. To warn you. Warn me about what? The summit, he said. 2 nights from now. You're being sent there as bait, whether you know it or not. Corvine wants leverage. The Alpha King wants you protected. And somewhere in between those 2 things, there are people who'd very much like to use you to get to him, through you, or over your dead body, whichever's more convenient. Ren's grip tightened on the shears. Why would you tell me that? The man looked at her for a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes, old, tired, carrying weight she couldn't begin to guess the shape of. Because I've watched good people get used as leverage before, he said. By Dominions who called it strategy, and slept fine afterward. I don't have much left in me anymore, that I'm proud of. A pause. But I'm not going to stand by and watch it happen to someone who didn't ask for any of it. You attacked his patrol, Ren said. It wasn't a guess, not really, the pieces were sliding into place fast now, faster than she wanted them to. 3 weeks ago. The border. That's how he got hurt, isn't it? That's how all of this started. The man's jaw tightened. You're Dominion's king, he said, and there was real venom in it now, buried under years of control, burned my family's territory to the ground 11 years ago in a border expansion nobody remembered by the time the ink dried on the treaty. I lost people that day who never got so much as a line in a history record. His voice dropped. So yes. I hit his patrol. And I'd do it again. Then why warn me, Ren said, quiet. If you hate him that much. Because you're not him, the man said simply. And I've spent 11 years watching my own grief turn me into something I don't recognize most mornings. I'm not interested in watching it happen to somebody else too. He stepped back into the dark past the light's edge. Watch yourself at that summit, he said. There are more players in this than you know. And not all of them are as honest with you as I've just been. Then he was gone. No trace. No sound of footsteps in the gravel. Ren stood alone in the dark for a long time, shears still gripped in one shaking hand, and did not sleep at all that night. She never learned his name. She would learn it soon enough. But not that night, not standing alone in a gravel lot, with her whole careful, quiet life about to come apart at every seam she'd spent 3 years stitching shut. She told Shadow everything the next evening. Sitting on the greenhouse floor, surrounded by trays of lavender cuttings just beginning to show their first true leaves, holding one up to the light, while she talked, the way she always talked to him, when the words were too heavy to say to anyone who might actually answer back. A man came to see me last night, she said. At the nursery. After close. Draven, lying beside her, with his head on her thigh, went very still. He said I'm being used, she went on, quiet. Bait is the word he used. For the summit. Something about leverage. About the Alpha King wanting me protected, and somebody else wanting to use me against him. Every muscle in Draven's body had locked rigid. Because he knew, with sick and total certainty, exactly who that man had to be. Nobody else on the continent had reason to approach her in the dark, with a warning like that. Nobody else carried that particular mixture of hatred and conscience. Rurik Vane had walked straight up to the one person Draven would have died to protect, and told her the truth. Draven himself had been too much of a coward to say out loud. The shame of that landed somewhere deep and permanent. He said his family's territory got burned. Ren went on, running her thumb slowly along the edge of the cutting in her hand. 11 years ago. By my Dominion's king, he said. Like it was a fact everybody already knew. She looked down at Draven, and something in her expression had shifted, some new and careful weight behind her eyes. Is that true, Shadow? Do you know anything about that? You've been around this territory longer than anyone knows, haven't you? Sometimes I think you understand more than a wolf should. He looked up at her. There was no answer he could give her. Not the real one. Not yet. She sighed and went back to the cutting in her hand, turning it gently under the light. I don't know what any of it means, she said. I just know I've got a letter on my kitchen table telling me to show up in 2 days, and be looked at like livestock. And a stranger in the dark telling me I'm bait. And a man at the nursery, who buys 47 trays of lavender for no reason, and looks at me sometimes like. She stopped. Didn't finish the sentence. Sometimes I think you're the only honest thing left in my life, she said instead, quieter. And you can't even talk. He pressed his head harder into her hand. If she'd looked at him just then, really looked, the way she looked at a struggling cutting, when she was trying to see exactly where the damage was, she might have seen something in his eyes that no ordinary wolf's eyes should have carried. Guilt, sharp and total. Love, raw and unguarded. And underneath both of those, a decision finally, fully made. He was done hiding. 2 more days. He would tell her everything the moment the summit was behind them. He did not yet know how badly that plan was about to fall apart. Bastion brought him the last piece of the puzzle the night before they left for the summit, standing once more at the tree line, both men in human form, both grim in the particular way of soldiers, who know a storm is close enough now to smell. I found the second name, Bastion said. No preamble. He'd learned, over the past 2 weeks, that preamble only cost time neither of them had. Who? Vyer's second. A junior council officer named Corin Ashgate. He's the one who filed the false requisition date I caught Vyer on. And he's the one who had access to the chamber the night of the assassination. Bastion's jaw tightened. I think he's the one who let the killer in. Maybe not the one who did the killing himself. But he opened the door. Draven absorbed that in silence. Do we move on him? Not yet, Bastion said. If we move now, whoever he answers to just cuts him loose the same way they cut Vyer loose. We need him to lead us somewhere, before we take him. He'll be at the summit tomorrow, the whole council will. Draven's eyes narrowed. You think he's going to try something there? I think, Bastion said slowly, that a summit, with every alpha of significance on the continent gathered in one hall, is exactly the kind of chaos somebody planning something ugly would want. Crowds. Confusion. A dozen different grievances already simmering in the room, before anyone even opens their mouth. He looked at Draven directly. I think you should not go. I have to go, Draven said. Immediate. Absolute. She'll be there. Alone. Being handed around like an asset for a woman who threw her out 3 years ago and only wants her back now that she's worth something. I am not letting her walk into that room without me in it. Bastion held his gaze for a long moment. Then nodded, slow, resigned, the way a man nods when he already knew the answer before he asked the question and had simply needed to hear his king say it out loud. Then we go in ready, Bastion said. Full guard. No surprises. No surprises, Draven agreed. Neither man believed it, not really. Some old soldier's instinct in both of them already understood that tomorrow night was going to unravel every careful plan they'd made, all at once, in front of witnesses. They were right. The morning of the summit, Ren stood in front of her bedroom mirror in a borrowed dress, too large in the shoulders, too short in the hem, the only formal thing the nursery's receptionist owned that came anywhere close to fitting, and did not recognize the woman looking back at her. Shadow watched from the doorway. "I don't know how to do this," she said, to the mirror, to him, to nobody. "I don't know how to walk into a room full of alphas and let them look at me like I'm available. Like a shelf item." Her hands smoothed down the front of the dress, a nervous, useless gesture. "I haven't belonged anywhere in 3 years. And now I'm supposed to walk into the one place that made me feel that way and pretend I'm grateful for the invitation." She turned from the mirror. Knelt in front of him, the way she always did, when the words needed somewhere honest to land. "Whatever happens tonight," she said, "I need you to know you're the only thing in the last 3 years that made any of this feel bearable." Her voice cracked, just slightly, on the last word. "I don't know what I would have done without you showing up in my yard that night, bleeding half to death, and stubborn as hell about it. I don't know who I'd be." He pressed his forehead against hers. Held it there. If he could have spoken in that moment, if the shift hadn't cost him everything a wolf could not do, if his throat had allowed him even one true sentence, he would have told her the only thing that mattered. "You would be exactly who you are. Because none of what you just said was ever about the wolf. It was always about you. The way you talk to dying things, until they live. The way you never once, not one single time in 3 weeks, made me feel like a burden. I am the one who doesn't deserve what you've given me." But he said nothing, because he could say nothing, and she rose from the floor and wiped her eyes and squared her shoulders and became, in the space of one long breath, the composed, careful woman who had survived 3 years of quiet erasure, without ever once letting it break her all the way through. "Okay," she said, mostly to herself. "Okay." She left for the summit an hour later. Shadow did not go with her. Could not in that form, not into a hall full of alphas who'd smell exactly what he was the moment he crossed the threshold. He shifted, alone, in the cold morning air behind her house, and dressed in the clothes Bastian had left folded on the fence post, and became, for the first time in 3 weeks, fully and completely Draven Ashwood again. King. Not stray. He looked at himself in the truck's side mirror for a long moment. A stranger's face, almost, after so many weeks spent living behind a wolf's eyes. Then he got in the truck and drove north, toward the Grey Mist Lodge, toward a summit that Bastian's intelligence said was already crawling, with danger neither of them could fully see yet, toward a woman who had no idea the man about to walk into that hall, and the wolf who'd slept curled around her for 3 weeks were one and the same. He had promised himself he'd tell her the moment the summit was behind them. He did not know yet that the summit itself was about to make that promise for him, loudly, violently, in front of every witness who mattered. Some secrets do not get the dignity of a quiet ending. His was about to become one of those. The Grey Mist Lodge was built to impress. Timber beams the size of tree trunks. Antler chandeliers trying very hard to look rustic, and succeeding only in looking expensive. Every surface polished, until it threw the firelight back twice as bright. Ren stood near the back wall, and hated all of it. Because the dress didn't fit right. Because her borrowed shoes pinched. Because every alpha in the room could smell her, and she could feel them noticing, feel their eyes tracking her the way you'd track livestock at auction, and some small animal part of her wanted to crawl under the refreshment table and stay there, until the whole thing was over. She pulled at the too large shoulder of the dress. Again. A nervous habit she couldn't stop. Soren found her within minutes. He looked effortlessly correct in a dark suit, blonde hair pushed back, and his smile, when he found her against the wall, was warm. Real. "You look terrified," he said. "I am," she said. Flat. Honest. No point pretending otherwise, not to him. He laughed. Quiet. Kind. "You don't have to agree to anything tonight," he said. Whatever Corvine told you. A courtship declaration is a request. Not a command. A beat. You can say no. She looked at him. The guilt in her chest was physical. Because he was good. Genuinely good, in a way that made the whole evening feel even worse somehow, and the compass in her chest was still pointing somewhere else entirely. Somewhere it had been pointing for 3 weeks. She just didn't know why yet. The doors opened and the room changed. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just a shift. Conversation stumbling mid-sentence. Spines straightening across the hall like a wind had moved through the room and touched every wolf at once. Draven Ashwood walked in wearing a black suit and an expression that could curdle milk. He had not been invited. The Alpha King did not require invitations. Corvine intercepted him before he'd cleared 10 feet into the room, composure smooth, practiced, the composure of a woman who had not expected him and was absolutely not going to show it. King Ashwood, she said. We're honored. Corvine. No title. A correction so small it barely registered, and so devastating, that every wolf in earshot felt the power shift like a change in gravity. You had an omega removed from your registry without due process. I'd like to understand how that happened. Corvine's composure held. Barely. The tendons in her neck told a different story. An administrative error, she said. Which has been corrected. Has it? She's here tonight, Corvine said. As a full member of this pack. Eligible for courtship. I'd call that more than corrected. He studied her for a long moment. Long enough that she felt it in her spine. Because he understood exactly what she was. Not cruel. Efficient. A woman who made decisions that were logical and defensible and quietly devastating to the people caught underneath them, and somewhere in that logic a girl had spent 3 years, without a healer, without a pack, without so much as a returned phone call. A line item. Balanced. He wanted to put his fist through the refreshment table. He walked toward the back wall instead. The crowd parted for him. It always did. Ren looked up and found him crossing the room toward her, and something in her chest rearranged itself into a shape it had never held before. Draven, she said. Genuine surprise. What are you doing here? Soren extended a hand, easy, unbothered, either very brave or very stupid, possibly both. King Ashwood. Prince Soren Larkspur. Your Fern initiative has been the talk of our botanical society. Somewhere behind Draven, Bastion closed his eyes in silent agony. Draven shook the offered hand. Precise pressure. A man exercising superhuman restraint. Prince Soren, he said. I understand you've been spending time with Miss Sorrel. Ren frowned. How do you know my last name? I never told you my last name. Silence. The specific silence of a man who has just made a tactical error and knows it immediately, completely, with no way to unsay it. Soren, oblivious to the minefield he'd just wandered into, smiled. She's remarkable, isn't she? I was actually hoping to speak with you about her registry status. The removal was irregular, and I believe a formal. The lodge doors slammed open. 3 wolves came through first. Full shift. Scarred, enormous, radiating the sharp copper stink of a fight already decided in their own minds. Behind them, a 4th figure walked in on 2 legs, a man, with a face like cracked leather, and eyes that swept the room with flat, total calculation. Ren's stomach dropped. She knew that face. Rurik Vane. Alpha King, he said, and his voice carried the ragged edge of a man who'd spent too long living rough, and forgotten what an indoor voice sounded like. You killed 4 of my wolves at your border. I've come for the blood debt. The room went dead silent. Ren looked at Draven. What is happening? Everything happened at once. Rurik's wolves lunged. Not at Draven. Rogues didn't attack an alpha king head-on, not if they wanted to survive the attempt. At the crowd instead. At the civilians. At the woman standing against the back wall in a dress too big in the shoulders. Draven moved before thought finished forming. His body shifted between one heartbeat and the next, suit shredding as his frame exploded outward, and where a man had stood a moment before, a wolf now stood, massive, black, terrible, jaws open, eyes blazing the deep gold of an alpha in full, lethal fury. He hit the first rogue mid-leap. Jaws closing on its shoulder, with a crack that echoed off the timber beams. The second came from the left. He caught it, with a sweep of his forepaw that sent it crashing through a table of canapes and decorative gourds. The third circled wide. Going for Ren. Soren stepped in front of her. He shifted in a burst of blonde fur, lean and fast, and met the rogue head-on, with a snarl that carried more courage than calculation. The rogue was bigger. Soren didn't care. He held the line for the 3 seconds it took Draven to cross the room, and then Draven's jaws closed around the third rogue's neck, and it was over. Rurik stood alone by the doors. His wolves were down. His face carried something that wasn't quite fear. Recognition, maybe. He looked at the massive black wolf standing in the wreckage of the lodge, and he looked at the Omega pressed against the wall behind a bleeding prince, and something in his expression shifted, all at once, all the way through. "She's yours," he said quietly. "I can smell it from here." He turned. Walked out. He did not run. Whatever else Rurik Vane was, he was a man who had lost, and knew it, and left with the only dignity still available to him, the dignity of not pretending otherwise. The room stayed silent a long moment, after the doors closed behind him. Ren stood against the wall. Her borrowed dress torn at the hem. Her hands shaking. She stared at the massive black wolf standing in the wreckage, fur matted with blood that wasn't its own, gold eyes fixed on her, with an intensity that burned straight through everything she thought she'd understood about the last 3 weeks. She knew those eyes. She knew that fur. The ridge of muscle along the shoulders. The scar on the left flank, still pink, still tender. The exact shape of the head that had rested on her lap 100 times, while she talked about lavender cuttings, and loneliness and an unnamed compass in her chest. "Shadow," she whispered. The wolf lowered its head. Then the shift began. Slow this time. Deliberate. He gave her every second of it, let her watch the fur recede, the bones reshape, the man emerge from the animal, because he owed her that much. He owed her the truth without shortcuts. Draven Ashwood stood before her. Human. Barefoot. Wearing the shredded remains of a suit that had cost more than her annual rent. She looked at him. And he watched the exact moment understanding crashed through her like a wave hitting a wall. "You," she said. Her voice barely a breath. "Your shadow." "Yes. You're the wolf. You've been, this whole time. You've been." She stopped. Her mouth opened and closed. Her eyes filled, and she blinked hard against it. "The bath," she said. The word came out wrong, like it tasted wrong in her mouth. "I bathed you. I talked to you. I told you things I've never told anyone." Her voice cracked. "I told you about the compass in my chest. And you were right there. You were right there, and you didn't tell me. Ren. Don't." She held up a hand. Chin trembling. Voice iron. "Don't say my name like you're sorry." She laughed, a broken, airless sound. "You lied to me every single day. You lay on my floor and let me think you were a lost animal. And you were what? The Alpha King." Another laugh, worse than the first. "Is that what the ferns were about? The 47 trays of lavender. There's no restoration project. Is there? No. And the rabbit. The sage. The honeycomb. She pressed both hands against her face. Oh my God. The honeycomb. You had bee stings on your face, and I picked them out, with tweezers, and I called you a brave boy. You're the Alpha King, and I called you a brave boy. From the sideline, Bastian made a sound that might have been a cough. It was, unmistakably, a suppressed laugh. Ren dropped her hands. Eyes wet. Steady. Why, she said. Why did you stay? The room was full of witnesses. Corvine's pack. Soren. The defeated rogues, Bastian, a dozen others, every ear in the hall tuned to whatever the Alpha King said next. He could have given something dignified. Something appropriate for a king addressing a court. Duty. Fate. The ancient pull between bonded pairs. Instead he said the true thing. Because you talked to your cuttings, he said. You held them up to the light, and told them you believed in them. And I had never once in my life heard anyone speak to a living thing, with that much faith. She stared at him. And then you talked to me the same way, he said. And I couldn't leave. I kept telling myself, one more night. One more morning. One more time hearing you laugh at something I did. He paused. The glove. I'm sorry about the glove. My wolf didn't like Soren much. The glove, she repeated, flat. You ate my gardening glove, because you were jealous of a prince. From across the room, Soren, back in human form now, bleeding from a gash on his shoulder he didn't seem to notice, offered, mildly, to be fair. I did bring her a first-edition propagation manual. That's fairly provocative. Ren looked at Soren. Then at Draven. Then up at the ceiling, like she was asking it for patience it had no intention of giving her. I need you to leave, she told Draven. Right now. I need to think. And I can't think, when you're standing there looking like that. Like what? Like you mean it. She walked out of the lodge. He let her go. It was the hardest thing he had ever done, and he had taken a throne by combat. She didn't go home that night. She went to the nursery instead, and sat alone in greenhouse 4 among the propagation benches, and the trays of cuttings she'd coaxed, into life one impossible root at a time. She cried. Then she stopped crying, and repotted an entire flat of rosemary starts, because her hands needed to do something, or she was going to scream, and somewhere around the third tray her thoughts started organizing themselves, into something less like grief, and more like an accounting. He lied. He lied every day, for 3 weeks, and let her fall in love, with 2 men, who turned out to be one. But he also stayed. Through a wound that should have sent him running back to his own healers, within a day. Through weeks of scrambled eggs, and shampoo and a stray rabbit he clearly hadn't known what to do, with once he'd caught it. He'd bought 47 trays of lavender, because he didn't know how to say I want to be near you, and this was the only language he had for it. That didn't erase the lie. It just meant the lie was more complicated than she'd first let herself see. At 3 in the morning, she heard a sound at the greenhouse door. Not a knock. A scratch. Low. Tentative. Apologetic. She opened it. He sat on the concrete pad outside, wolf again, enormous and black, and still, gold eyes fixed on her, with an expression that was, on a wolf's face, as close to pleading as anatomy allowed. In his mouth, a single stem of wild sage. Unbruised. Perfectly cut. She looked at the sage. Looked at him. You're an idiot, she said. Her voice cracked on the last word. He set the sage down at her feet. Didn't move. She stood in the doorway a long time. Cold night air. Frost and pine and turned earth. The greenhouse behind her warm and bright, full of things she'd saved, from death through patience, and attention, and faith. You lied to me, she said. He lowered his head. You ate my glove. Lower still. You ordered 1,200 ferns nobody needed. His ears flattened. She crouched. I level with him now, the gold of his eyes catching the greenhouse light behind her, something molten in it, something that had been burning for weeks and could not be put out. If you ever lie to me again, she said, quiet, I will shave you bald and donate the fur to a craft fair. Do you understand me? He understood her perfectly. She picked up the sage. Pressed her face into his neck. His body curled around hers, and the compass in her chest swung north, and settled and locked into place, and she felt the bond snap shut like a key turning in a lock she hadn't known she was carrying her whole life. The claiming happened 3 days later. Not at the Greymist Lodge. Not at any throne hall. At the nursery, in Greenhouse 4, surrounded by propagation trays, and bags of perlite, and the sweet green smell of 10,000 cuttings reaching toward the light. Draven stood in human form, before his pack, his war council, the assembled alphas of 4 territories, and Hollis, who'd been told only that there was an event at his nursery, and had shown up in his work boots, standing beside a division commander, and looking deeply uncomfortable about it. He had considered a speech. Bastion had drafted one. 4 pages. Historical precedent. Territorial law. Draven read the first sentence and threw it away. She is mine, he said. Simple. And I am hers. If anyone in this room or any room has a problem with that, you can take it up with me personally. I'll be happy to educate you on the consequences. Nobody had a problem with it. Corvine stood in the second row, expression perfectly neutral. When Ren walked past her afterward, Corvine said, Congratulations. Luna. And something in her voice snagged, some small rough edge, barely there. Her eyes went to Ren's wrists, to the faint swelling, from years of repetitive work she'd never once been allowed to have treated. I'll ensure the pack healers are available to you immediately, Corvine said. For whatever you need. It wasn't an apology. But it was an acknowledgement, brief, inadequate, real, that a form had never been filed, and a woman had paid for it in pain, and the system that allowed that was a system Corvine had built, and maintained, and benefited, from every single day of the 3 years it stood. Ren looked at her a long moment. Then nodded once, and moved on. Rurik came, too. Uninvited, at the very edge of the tree line, watching from a distance he clearly intended to keep. Bastion saw him first, and reached for a blade, before Draven's hand caught his wrist. Let him stand there, Draven said. Rurik did not come closer. But he didn't leave either, not until the ceremony was over, not until he'd watched, from that careful distance, the woman he'd warned in a dark parking lot standing whole and claimed and, by every measure that mattered, finally home. Then he turned. Walked into the trees. Draven made a decision, that night that would take his council months to fully understand. He did not send hunters after Rurik Vane. He sent Bastion instead, with an offer. A hearing. A chance to lay 11 years of grief on a table in front of witnesses instead of in the dark at the edge of somebody's border. It wasn't forgiveness. It was the beginning of something that might, eventually, become peace. Soren kissed Ren's hand before he left. Told her, with total sincerity, that she was a better woman than any of them deserved, and that the propagation manual was hers to keep. He had a bruise along his jaw, and a bandage on his shoulder, and he smiled at Draven, without a trace of resentment in it. Take care of her, he said. Then, almost as an afterthought, for what it's worth. The ferns are doing quite well at the military bases. Your soldiers started a gardening club. Draven did not know what to do with that information. He filed it away for later. Which was, as it happened, his standard approach to anything that confused him. That night, in the house that had once been a potting shed, and was now under Bastion's increasingly exasperated supervision, being extensively and expensively renovated. Wren lay in bed, and the wolf lay on the floor beside her. She leaned over the edge. "Come up here," she said. He jumped onto the bed. It groaned under his weight. She didn't care. She curled against his side, one arm draped over his massive ribs, face pressed into the thick fur of his neck. He smelled like pine and warmth, and faintly, still, after everything, oatmeal shampoo. "You know," she said, "I'm going to have to learn your real name. For things. Shadow isn't a very dignified name for an alpha king." He made a sound low in his throat. Not a growl. Closer to a purr, if wolves could purr, which they could not, though Draven had stopped pretending he followed the ordinary rules of wolf behavior about 3 weeks ago. She was quiet a moment. Her hand moved slowly through his fur, finding the scar on his left flank, tracing the raised line of it with one fingertip. "Does it still hurt?" she asked. No. She knew he was lying. She always knew. Her breath evened out. Her hand stilled in his fur. The room smelled like lavender and cedar shavings, and the wild sage still fresh in its jar on the windowsill. He kept his eyes open a long time, watching the slow rise and fall of her breathing. Feeling the weight of her arm across his ribs, the warmth of her body against his side. The compass needle in his own chest, the one he hadn't known he carried, until he found her kneeling in the mud at 2 a.m, talking to a dying foxglove like it mattered, pointed at her, steady, and did not waver. Then he closed his eyes. The last thing he heard, before sleep, was her voice. Barely a murmur, drifting up from somewhere between waking and dreaming. "Good night, Shadow." A pause. "Good night, Draven. Sleep well." He slept well.